On Christmas Eve, my son pushed his chair back with a deliberate scrape against the floor. The sound silenced the forks and the small chatter at the table. He fixed his eyes on me, his own father, and with a sharp voice that cut through the warmth of the holiday, he said, "You're not qualified." It was not a private remark. It was a declaration, a verdict announced in front of his wife, his children, and his colleagues who had been invited into my home under the pretense of family and festivity. The words dropped like iron on the table, heavier than the silence that followed. No toast, no laughter of celebration, only the kind of laughter that sneaks out when cruelty feels safe, nervous, mocking, but confirming what he wanted, that I was no longer seen as someone who belonged in the conversation. My son, now a lawyer for a powerful developer, used that moment to place a crown upon his own head. He stacked his papers neatly beside him, as if the documents themselves proved superiority. He spoke to his colleagues about modern codes and new methods, gesturing toward me only as an example of what was outdated, what no longer mattered. He didn't need to say "old man." It was painted in every pause, every glance. He wanted me diminished, erased. His wife smirked, swirling the wine in her glass, pleased to watch me shrink in front of her guests. My grandson, still too young to understand the depth of betrayal, only copied the expressions he saw around him, the raised brows, the tilted chin, the look that said, "He doesn't belong here." Even the partners at the table, men who once shook my hand with respect, now shifted their attention to my son. To them, I was a shadow sitting at the edge of their success story, a relic, better left silent. But I did not argue. I didn't slam my fist on the table, didn't shout to demand respect. I let the silence stretch. Let them believe they had won. My son mistook my quiet as defeat, as proof that his words carried final authority. But I wasn't silent because I had no answer. I was silent because truth doesn't waste itself in petty fights. Truth doesn't rise to meet laughter or mockery. It waits. As I studied him across the table, I remembered the nights I carried him on my shoulders through construction sites, pointing to beams, foundations, and the language of steel and concrete. I remembered his small hands tracing the edges of my notebooks, asking questions about the world he now pretended I never knew. He had forgotten those nights, or maybe he had buried them under ambition and arrogance. But I hadn't. My notebook still carried the ink of those lessons. My hands still bore the scars of that work. And as he leaned back in his chair, smiling at his own cleverness, I felt no anger, only a steady certainty that his words would not be the end of my story. He could declare me unqualified in front of family. He could laugh with his colleagues. He could humiliate me under my own roof. But beyond this room, in the only place that truly mattered, the truth of my life's work would speak louder than any dismissal. There would come a day when his voice, so sharp and proud tonight, would falter in the face of evidence he could not twist. The court he trusted so blindly would recognize me, not as a father he cast aside, not as a man out of time, but as the expert he tried to bury. That day would come, and when it did, my silence at this table would be remembered not as weakness, but as the quiet strength of a man who didn't need to prove himself with words. Friends, let me pause here for a moment. Please write in the comments, where are you listening from? Has something similar ever happened in your life? Don't forget to subscribe and share this video. That's how you help us grow this channel. Now, let's continue. The first email arrived in the cold gray of morning, its subject line clinical, but its contents dripping with contempt. Motions to exclude. Arguments dressed in polished legal phrases, each sentence sharpened like a blade meant to cut me away from the case before it had even begun. My son's signature was there at the bottom, not a single word of warmth or hesitation, only the authority of his title and the power he thought it gave him. To him, I was not a father anymore, not even a man with decades of work etched into stone and steel. I was outdated. I was irrelevant. I was a hobbyist, playing at knowledge I could no longer grasp. The pages multiplied in the days that followed. Each one pressed harder against me, framing my life's work as little more than scribbles in old notebooks, dismissing what I had built as coincidence, accidents of time. My name appeared again and again, but never with respect, only with mockery cloaked in formality. They stripped me down in black ink, filing away my worth as though it could be erased by paper. These filings, so glossy, so pristine, spoke with the arrogance of men who believed the world began the year they were born. I sat at my desk, the weight of those documents stacked before me, the air thick with the smell of paper and toner. I did not read them once. I read them many times, until the words blurred into the same cold refrain. You are not enough. You are not qualified. And each time, I turned from those pages and laid my hand on a worn notebook resting nearby. The cover was cracked, the edges softened by years in the field, but inside, every page was alive. Field notes written in pencil and ink, temperatures carefully logged, weather conditions scrawled in margins, soil densities measured and recorded, core sample IDs listed one after another, with the kind of precision no glossy filing could fabricate. These notebooks were not written for courts or lawyers. They were written for truth. I placed their polished pages beside my weathered notes and stared at the contrast. On one side, a weapon of dismissal, heavy words without weight, designed to sway, not to reveal. On the other, the living memory of decades, records that smelled of earth and dust, each page carrying the echo of work done in rain, in heat, in the silence of dawn, when concrete was poured and foundations set. Their filings could name me irrelevant, but my notebooks whispered something louder, that I was there when it mattered, that I had measured, built, tested, recorded, that I had earned every word and number in those margins with the sweat of my hands and the clarity of my mind. I thought of my son then, of the boy who once watched me take these notes, who once held a flashlight steady as I wrote in the dark, his young face lit by the glow of a construction lamp. He had seen the importance of every number, every detail, every decision, and now, in his ambition, he chose to bury those same memories beneath legal arguments, hoping the court would never see the truth hidden in my notebooks. He believed his filings could outshine my experience, as though ink on smooth white paper could erase ink pressed into a lifetime of work. But I knew better. Paper shields may look strong, but they are fragile. They tear, they burn, they fold under the weight of reality. And when the time came, the court would not be swayed by polish alone. They would look beyond the words meant to exclude, beyond the arrogance of youth, and into the undeniable evidence of years that could not be erased. So I left the glossy stack where it was, untouched, unmoved, and returned to my notebook. I traced a line under the date of a project 20 years past, the numbers still sharp, the memory still vivid. The truth did not need decoration. The truth did not need approval. It simply needed to be seen. And when that moment arrived, no motion, no dismissal, no betrayal from my own blood would be strong enough to stop it. The chamber was quiet except for the slow, deliberate turning of pages. The judge sat at the long oak table, a stack of documents before him, each sheet heavier with truth than the lawyers around him wanted to admit. Their motions to exclude had been sharp, crafted with the precision of rhetoric, but rhetoric was no substitute for substance, and substance lay in those pages, pages my son had chosen not to read, or perhaps chosen to ignore. The judge's finger traced lines across my curriculum vitae, pausing at dates that stacked upon one another like steel rebars in a foundation. Every year accounted for, every project tied not to vague claims but to records, publications, recognitions. There were titles of peer-reviewed articles that bore my name, studies cited in conferences across the country, standards I had not only followed but had helped to write. My work had become part of the language of the industry, lines in code books that others built upon without ever asking who first placed them there, and now that authorship was being read aloud in silence, not for applause, not for pride, but for truth. The irony hung thick in the room. The very briefs my son had filed, dense, confident, filled with references to building standards and safety codes, had quoted documents that bore my signature on their earliest editions. He had leaned upon the very ground I had laid, unaware or unwilling to acknowledge that the soil beneath his argument was mine. His words accused me of irrelevance, yet his own citations whispered my name between their lines. The room shifted uncomfortably with that knowledge, but no one dared to name it. I watched the judge as he lingered over one section. 10 years spent on the National Code Committee, a decade of long evenings refining language that determined how every beam, every column, every span across the country would be built. I remembered the meetings, the debates, the stacks of technical data spread across tables in sterile conference halls. It had been slow work, patient work, but necessary. It was not glamorous, not loud, not the kind of achievement that made headlines, but it was the kind that endured. And here it was, inked into my record, undeniable. The lawyers shifted in their seats, trying to appear composed while the ground tilted beneath them. My son, seated at the far end, kept his eyes down, his jaw tight, as though ignoring the sound of those pages turning could make the facts disappear. He had wanted to paint me as a hobbyist, a man tinkering in obscurity. But the evidence unfolding before the judge told a different story. It told of a life built not on claims, but on contributions, not on ambition, but on responsibility. The room pretended not to taste the bitterness of irony, but it was there. I felt no need to point it out, no urge to gloat. I sat with quiet hands folded, letting the weight of truth settle into the chamber on its own. The judge needed no persuasion beyond the ink already before him. Every publication, every standard, every recognition stood taller than any insult, stronger than any dismissal. For years my son had tried to separate himself from me, to prove he was more, that he had risen above. But as those pages turned, it became clear that no matter how far he tried to climb, the very rungs he stood on bore my fingerprints. He could deny me in words, he could humiliate me in front of family, but the structure of his own success carried my name in silence. And as the last page was turned, the judge leaned back, the weight of recognition unspoken, but heavy in the air. I did not need to speak. The documents had spoken for me. My son had wanted me erased, but instead, the record had written me deeper into history, undeniable, unerasable. The papers in courtrooms spoke in polished sentences, but my truth lived in dust and ink. At night, while the lawyers sharpened their arguments, I opened boxes long stored away, each one carrying the weight of years most of them could not imagine. Inside were fragments of my life's work, photographs of construction sites where the air had been thick with cement, steel beams rising like ribs against the sky. In those pictures, young men in hard hats stood waiting for instructions, and in the corner of more than one frame, my own figure lingered, clipboard in hand, boots sunk into fresh earth. These were not decorations, they were records, evidence written not in theory, but in sweat. I pulled out the test cylinders, each one bearing my handwriting across the side in faded marker. Numbers, dates, initials, small details to anyone else, but to me they were the pulse of a project, proof of discipline, proof that every measure had been taken when it mattered. I remembered the mornings when I wrote them, my hands stiff from cold, the smell of wet concrete rising into the air as I bent to note the time, the slump, the batch number. They were not grand gestures, not speeches or declarations, but simple lines of truth preserved in my script. Now, years later, those same scrawls stood as silent witnesses, carrying more weight than the polished phrases my son had drafted. The site diaries lay open on the desk, pages smudged with dust and fingerprints, edges frayed from years of turning. I traced them slowly, my penmanship steady even after decades. Weather conditions noted with precision, delivery delays documented, structural checks listed one by one. No judge could argue with what was written there. No lawyer could laugh away the rain recorded on a Tuesday morning or the sudden crack of frost that forced a delay. The details were too exact, too mundane to be anything but true. They were my shield, but more than that, they were my voice, the voice my son had tried to silence at the dinner table, alive now in lines of graphite and ink. I was not angry as I turned to those pages. Anger had no place here, no use in the quiet work of assembling truth. Instead, I felt the steadiness of a man building a bridge, not from stone or steel this time, but from memory to proof, from what was lived to what could be shown. Every photograph was a beam laid across a gap. Every diary entry was a bolt, locking one moment to another. Every number, every date, every faded scribble pulled the past into the present until the structure of truth stood upright, undeniable. The lawyers had their motions, my son had his arrogance, but I had something heavier than all of it. Evidence born from discipline, preserved through time, carried in the fragile strength of paper and handwriting. These artifacts did not shout, did not argue, did not boast. They simply existed, and their existence was louder than insult. I looked at the spread before me, the photographs, the diaries, the cylinders marked with my hand, and I realized that I was not alone in this battle. Each entry was a witness, each note a voice joining mine. Together they told the story my son had tried to bury, the story no courtroom could ignore. I was not building a case for revenge or pride. I was building a bridge to justice, plank by plank, line by line, until no dismissal could tear it down. The courtroom was colder that morning, or perhaps it was only the weight of what was about to unfold. The opposing counsel rose with a practiced confidence, his voice steady, sharp with intent. He did not waste time on pleasantries. He came armed with questions designed not to illuminate but to dismantle, each one a stone placed deliberately to bar the way forward. Methodology, error rates, peer acceptance. He spoke as if the repetition itself could erode a lifetime of work, as if a man's memory and labor could be reduced to a series of technical traps. I sat there, with my notes closed, my hands folded calmly in front of me. This was not a duel of performance. This was not theater. I had nothing to prove through theatrics, nothing to win by raising my voice or sharpening my words. What I carried into that room was heavier than argument. It was clarity. The kind that needs no defense because it simply is. I began not with grand declarations, but with the language of the craft, the patient, exact vocabulary of decades spent ensuring structures would stand. I spoke of sample protocols, the chain of custody preserved through every test. I described calibration logs, each entry a checkpoint in the march of precision, the assurance that every instrument had been measured before it measured the world. My words were not colored with emotion. They were steady, like lines drawn on blueprints, firm and deliberate. When the counsel pressed about error rates, I did not falter. I traced the numbers as I once traced steel rebars and concrete. Coefficients, ranges, margins, each one calculated, verified, recorded. I named the standards not as vague references, but as exact pages, paragraph numbers, lines of code that bore the ink of committees I had once sat on, debates I had once endured. The truth was not abstract. It was indexed, published, peer-reviewed, accepted long before this courtroom had ever gathered. The silence that followed each answer was heavier than the question itself. The lawyer shifted, searching for cracks, but what I offered him was not something that could be broken. There was no bravado to attack, no flourish to unravel, only clarity, clarity that stood like a structure built to bear weight, far greater than his arguments could provide. I looked across the room and saw faces bending closer, jurors leaning in, the judge marking notes with care. They were not watching a performance. They were watching a man walk calmly through the gate that had been placed before him, carrying nothing but truth as his credential. My son, seated at the counsel's table, avoided my eyes. He had wanted me silenced, erased as unqualified. But now the questions he believed would expose me only revealed the depth of what I carried. The Daubert Gate was meant to be a barrier, a test of admissibility, the place where unsteady voices falter and are turned away. But for me, it was nothing more than familiar ground. Every question was a tool I had held before, every standard a language I had helped to write. I did not need to convince the room with passion or anger. I only needed to show them what was already true. And as the answers unfolded, method by method, page by page, the gate opened not with fanfare, but with inevitability. By the time I finished, the courtroom was still. The opposing counsel lowered his notes, unable to find another place to strike. The silence was not victory in the loud sense. It was something deeper, the silence of recognition, of certainty settling into place. They had asked for methodology, for peer acceptance, for proof, and I had given them something stronger, the undeniable presence of a life's work that needed no embellishment, only the steadiness of being seen. When my son rose from his chair, the air shifted. It was not like when the opposing counsel had stood. This was heavier, stranger, more dangerous. Blood was about to cross-examine blood. The title counsel for the defense gave him armor, but beneath it he was still the boy who once held my hand at construction sites. The boy who asked why concrete must cure before bearing weight, why steel must be aligned before being set. Now he stood taller, chin lifted, voice sharpened with formality, trying to carve me into something less than what I was. He began with my name, said in a way that stripped it of familiarity. Not father, not even Mr. Just a clipped syllable meant to sound neutral, but carrying the edge of dismissal. Then he pressed on with his strategy, phrases laced with subtle mockery, the kind that would sound professional on record, but personal to anyone who had lived inside the skin of family betrayal. He wanted to paint me as outdated, an amateur clinging to old methods, a man too close to his work to be objective. He thought the courtroom would echo his voice, would believe his distance gave him authority. I let the questions fall. I did not rush to answer, nor did I let silence humiliate me. Instead, I returned each one to its foundation. When he asked about procedures, I spoke of load paths, tracing in words the invisible journey of pressure through a building's skeleton, the way every beam, every column carried its share. When he tried to press me on time frames, I spoke of curing, how concrete must rest, how water must leave at its own pace, how strength is built not in haste but in patience. When he shifted toward discrediting my conclusions, I turned to moisture content, to the simple fact that water and stone, when misunderstood, turn to weakness, and weakness turns to failure. I spoke not to him, but to the court, and beyond them, to the building itself. My words belonged to the structures that stood or fell on these truths. They were not mine to decorate. They were principles older than me, stronger than argument, undeniable to anyone who had ever placed their trust beneath a roof. The courtroom stilled as I spoke. The rhythm of my answers was not argumentative. It was the rhythm of construction, steady, patient, deliberate, as if I were laying bricks of understanding one upon another until a wall stood where once there was only confusion. My son tried to interrupt, to redirect, but his voice faltered against the steadiness of mine. He wanted to rattle me, to expose cracks, but cracks appear only in what was poorly built. My answers carried no anger, no embellishment, only the weight of principles that could not be twisted. The more he pressed, the clearer it became. He was speaking in the language of strategy. I was speaking in the language of truth. And truth spoke louder. I looked at him only once, when his questions stumbled, when he realized he was not dismantling me, but unraveling himself. In that moment his voice caught, not enough for the record, but enough for me to hear, enough for me to recognize the hesitation of a son, facing not just a witness but the foundation of his own life. He had learned this language once, standing beside me as a boy. Now he tried to wield it against me, but the words returned home, and they did not belong to him. The silence that followed was not mercy, nor was it triumph. It was the quiet acknowledgement that he could not make Dad sound unprofessional, because what stood before him was not a father to be belittled, but a man whose life was poured into concrete, written in codes, carried in steel, and no courtroom, no lawyer, son, or stranger could erase that. The bailiff wheeled in the whiteboard, its surface spotless, waiting. The judge nodded once, granting me permission, and I rose slowly, carrying no notes, no exhibits, only memory, only truth. My son sat rigid, eyes fixed on his papers, but the room itself had shifted. The jurors leaned forward, the attorneys stilled, even the air felt expectant, as though the walls knew something important was about to be spoken without words. I picked up the piece of chalk, small and fragile between my fingers. It reminded me of the first days teaching apprentices, of drawing lines on concrete floors so they would understand where steel must run, where weight would fall, where failure would creep if carelessness was allowed. Now, decades later, I stood not in dust but in a courtroom, yet the lesson was the same. The chalk squeaked against the board, the sound sharp in the silence. First I drew the slab, a rectangle, simple, clean. Then came the rebar, the invisible skeleton beneath, lines crossing like veins through stone. My hand was steady, not rushed. Every stroke carried the memory of real beams, real workers, real days under sun and rain. Then, slowly, I marked the cold joint, the line where shortcuts had been taken, where haste had betrayed patience, where strength had been traded for speed. Around it, I sketched the void, a hollow space no one wanted to admit existed, and when I finished, the board no longer looked like a drawing. It looked like a wound. I turned, chalk still in hand, and pointed to the gap. "Here," I said, not in anger, not in accusation, but in clarity. "This is where hours were saved, and this," my hand circled the hollow space, "is where lives were placed at risk." The courtroom leaned closer. No one needed advanced degrees to understand the lines before them. They were simple, undeniable. Even a child could see it. What had been built was not whole. It was compromised, broken, long before the first crack appeared. I marked the path of weight, tracing with chalk the journey of stress through concrete. It stopped abruptly where the void lay. The board seemed to sag beneath the simple geometry, the truth written in white dust. The jurors shifted, whispering to one another, their eyes moving from the drawing to the faces of the lawyers who had tried to bury these facts in language. The chalk had cut through all of it. I remembered the men who had worked under me, their faces lined with fatigue, their shirts soaked with sweat. I remembered telling them again and again, "We do it right, or we don't do it at all." And I remembered the day I had visited that site years later, after others had taken control, after shortcuts had been made. I had seen the flaws then, felt the weakness beneath my feet. I had warned, but my words had been set aside. Now, years later, those warnings had returned in chalk, standing taller than any argument. The dust clung to my fingertips, fine and pale, a reminder that truth is not polished or pristine. It is gritty, it stains, it lingers. And as I stood before the court, I knew this was no longer about me defending my name. This was about every person who would walk through those doors, every family who would trust that roof to hold above them. My son's arguments had been for strategy, for winning. Mine were for lives. And the difference between the two was written plainly now for all to see. When I put the chalk down, the silence was absolute. No one laughed. No one smirked. Even the air felt heavier, as if the room itself had inhaled and forgotten how to breathe. The board stood there like a mirror, showing not just lines, but choices. Choices that had traded safety for profit. Choices defended by lawyers who had never held chalk, never poured concrete, never stood in the dust of unfinished walls. I stepped back, hands dusted white, and sat without another word. The truth was there, clear, unshakable, drawn in lines that no brief could erase. The courtroom still held the ghost of chalk dust when I reached into the box beside me and lifted a book so heavy it seemed to breathe with its own authority. Its spine was creased from years of use, its pages stiff with the weight of regulations that had shaped the skylines of cities, the walls of schools, the floors of hospitals. This was not a book of opinions. This was the code, the voice of safety, the language that bound every engineer, every builder, every contractor to the duty of building not for profit first, but for life. My son had waved this book away once, casually, as if it were an artifact of an older time, as if real knowledge lived only in his filings, his rhetoric, his courtroom maneuvers. He had mistaken paper for power. But as I placed the code on the desk, opening it with slow care, the sound of its binding cracked louder than any objection could. The pages fell open naturally to sections I had turned to again and again over the years, sections I had debated in committee rooms, sections where my notes still lingered in faint pencil marks in the margins. I began to read, not in flourish, not in argument, but clause by clause, word by word, each one carrying the weight of obligation. The courtroom leaned forward as I traced the failures, not as interpretations, but as violations. Where they had poured too soon, I found the line, required curing time shall not be less than. Not a suggestion, not advice. Required. Where steel had been misaligned, I read, reinforcement shall be placed in accordance with. Not optional, not negotiable, shall. Each phrase struck like a hammer on steel, echoing into silence. The judge leaned forward, his pen moving across the page, underlining sections as I read them aloud. The sound of ink scratching against paper filled the chamber, steady, deliberate. Every time I paused, the stillness was broken not by argument, but by the quiet intake of breath from the gallery, as if the air itself was forced to acknowledge the gravity of those words. One whisper rose behind me, incredulous, and died mid-breath when the judge lifted his eyes over his glasses, the underlined paragraphs glowing like verdicts before the verdict. I laid the failures side by side with the obligations. A missing inspection became not negligence, but a violation of Section 7.3. An improper joint was not a mistake of oversight, but a breach of Clause 12.1. Every corner cut, every hour saved at the cost of safety, stood exposed not as differences of opinion, but as defiance of written law. I was not giving them my perspective. I was handing them the words the builders themselves had sworn to follow, the very lines the defense had once cited in their own briefs. Only now, the irony was stripped bare. The book they had dismissed held the proof of their guilt. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. The power was in the words themselves, etched into regulations that had outlived governments and industries, written not by one man, but by generations who understood that safety was never negotiable. These words did not serve me. They served the people who lived and worked in the shadows of those structures. They served truth. When I closed the book, the sound was final, like the shutting of a door. My hands rested on its cover for a moment, feeling the familiar weight. I had lived these codes, taught them, enforced them. They were not abstract lines to me. They were nights without sleep, arguments fought in committee rooms, signatures affixed after weeks of relentless debate. And now, in this courtroom, they stood taller than any argument, stripping away rhetoric until nothing was left but obligation unmet. I looked at my son then. His face was still, his pen motionless. He could not dismiss what had just been read. He could not twist required into optional. He could not erase the underlines now drawn by the judge's own hand. What he had tried to make sound like my opinion was now revealed as the unbending voice of law itself. The silence that followed was deeper than before. It was the silence of a room confronted not with persuasion, but with duty. not with debate, but with truth. And in that silence, for the first time, the weight shifted, not toward my son, not toward his client, but toward justice, clause by clause, word by word, undeniable. The courtroom had already seen drawings in chalk, already heard the voice of the code. But now it was time for something colder, something sharper, something that could not be bent by rhetoric or softened by persuasion. I opened the binder of calculations, pages filled not with opinions, but with numbers, silent, impartial witnesses that do not change their story, no matter who questions them. The room seemed to grow smaller as I began, because mathematics has no patience for pretense. I started with live loads, tracing the expected weight of human life, of furniture, of movement through a building meant to hold families, workers, strangers passing each other in hallways. Line by line, the equations showed what the structure should have borne with ease. Then I set beside it the actual capacity, reduced by shortcuts, weakened by rushed curing, undermined by voids no eye could see until it was too late. The gap was visible, cruel, undeniable. Before a single crack appeared on the surface, the building had already been a failure. The jurors leaned forward as I moved through the safety factors, those margins meant to protect against the unknown, the unpredictable, the very things engineers build for because life is never predictable. But here, the margins had been erased, shaved thin until there was nothing left to absorb the weight of error. I did not raise my voice. I let the numbers speak for themselves. The columns, the slabs, the reinforcements, they had been calculated like a gambler's bet, not an engineer's duty. The numbers revealed the truth. Risk had been disguised as competence. Then came the slump tests, those simple, almost humble measurements of concrete consistency, meant to tell whether the mixture would harden into strength or into weakness. My records bore the results, and the results were merciless. Too much water, too much haste. Every number was a story of neglect, each decimal a quiet admission of betrayal. The defense had tried to suggest such things were trivial, but trivial does not bring buildings down. Trivial does not cost lives. These numbers were not minor. They were the heartbeat of the structure, and the pulse had been wrong from the very beginning. Finally, I brought forward the analysis of chloride intrusion, the chemistry of decay, the slow corrosion that eats steel from within, invisible until the day it breaks. The samples I had examined told a story written in molecules, protection ignored, exposure unchecked. It was not fate, not bad luck, it was neglect, proven in the smallest particles. Science itself testified now, speaking a language no jury needed to doubt. I looked across the courtroom as the calculations settled over the room like cold air. There was no drama in these pages, no flourish in these equations. Numbers do not bend under pressure. They do not shift when paid. They do not care who stands in the courtroom, whether a lawyer or a father or a son. They only reveal what is true, and the truth, set out before everyone, was merciless. The structure had been doomed long before the first visible crack split its face. For the first time, I saw the jurors exchange glances not of confusion, but of recognition. They understood. They might not have known the formulas, but they knew what it meant when safety factors vanish, when strength is compromised, when trust is broken. It was not abstract anymore. It was real, heavy, human. The numbers had taken the place of testimony, colder than words, stronger than voices. I rested my hand on the binder, feeling the weight of the paper, the ink, the evidence. These were not my numbers alone. They were the truth carved out by physics, chemistry, time itself. And as I closed the binder, the silence that followed was heavier than anything I had yet spoken. The courtroom had heard enough to know. The building had not failed by accident. It had failed long before it was ever finished. The lawyer rose again, his voice carrying a final trace of defiance, the desperate flourish of a man who felt the ground sliding beneath him. He gestured toward me, toward the binders, the codes, the chalk lines, and with a tight smile asked if all of this was merely my view, one man's interpretation of a complicated matter. The question was meant to plant doubt, to suggest that what I had offered was perspective, not proof. It was his last weapon, a hope that uncertainty might still save his case. I did not answer with words. Instead, I reached for a folder I had kept aside, the one that did not carry my handwriting but the seal of the laboratory. I placed it on the rail, its cover marked with dates and signatures, the chain of custody intact from collection to analysis. Inside were the reports, pages of spectra, graphs that told stories in peaks and valleys, photographs taken at 200 times magnification showing the very fractures, the very voids, the very corrosion that no speech could conceal. Each timestamp aligned with the work, each image a shard of truth magnified until denial was impossible. The jurors leaned closer, their eyes tracing the lines of evidence that bore no opinion, no human inflection. These were not my numbers, not my claims. They were the voice of the material itself. Concrete, steel, chemistry, all of it speaking louder than argument. The photographs revealed pores where there should have been strength, cracks invisible to the naked eye but catastrophic in waiting. They told the same story I had spoken, but colder, sharper, unanswerable. The opposing counsel fell silent, his smile brittle now. He had asked for proof and received something heavier than he expected. The courtroom shifted. I felt it in the way the jurors sat back with certainty, in the way the gallery's whispers died away, in the way even the judge's pen paused as if there was nothing left to underline. The air itself changed. This was no longer about who argued better, who sounded more convincing. This was the moment when opinion stepped aside and evidence took the stand. I stood there quietly, hands resting on the folder, not gloating, not triumphant. The truth did not need celebration. It only needed to be seen. And in that moment, the room had turned. When my son rose again, his posture had changed. Gone was the easy sharpness, the confident rhythm of a lawyer who believed the room belonged to him. His voice, once so steady, thinned as he fumbled through another question. But the words no longer carried weight. They trailed off into the silence between us, and in that silence something broke. Not in the case, but in him. The clerk placed another set of documents before me, site diaries and field notes, with my handwriting sprawled across the margins. Ink faded by time, smudged by dust and weather, but still legible, still precise. I saw his eyes fall upon them, and I knew the recognition was immediate. These were the same notebooks he had once held as a child, too heavy for his small hands, pages fluttering as he turned them with awe. Back then, he had bragged to his friends that his father built bridges, that the world rose from drawings and numbers I carried in my pocket. Now those same pages, the ones he had mocked as relics at the dinner table, stood taller than his arguments. Betrayal, once his armor, curdled into shame. I saw it in the way he could not meet my eyes, in the way his voice cracked as he tried to continue, in the way his pen tapped uselessly against the table. For all his training, all his polish, he could not cross-examine the handwriting that had guided his childhood. He could not argue against the very lines that had built the structures he once stood proudly upon. He stared at the table as though it might rescue him, but wood does not return a gaze. It only reflects the weight placed upon it. And in that moment, the weight pressing down on him was not just the failure of his case, it was the collapse of the image he had crafted, the story in which he was the one who had risen above a father too small, too outdated, too easily dismissed. Now the truth sat in front of him, and it carried my name. I did not gloat, I did not smile. I only watched quietly, feeling not triumph, but something heavier, something that lingered between sorrow and inevitability. My son's silence was not victory, it was recognition. Recognition that he had tried to erase me, but what he had sought to bury was the very foundation beneath his own feet. and no courtroom, no argument, no dismissal could change that. The chamber was still when the judge adjusted his glasses and leaned forward. The stack of filings lay to one side, the binders of evidence to the other, and between them hung a silence so thick it seemed the room itself was holding its breath. For hours they had heard the numbers, the codes, the photographs, the chalk lines that still lingered faintly on the board. For hours they had weighed the voice of a father against the arguments of his own son. Now there was no more to weigh. The judge's tone was measured, yet the words carried the weight of finality. Credentials established, testimony admitted, and then, spoken with deliberate clarity, the line that cut deeper than any gavel could. The court recognizes the witness as an expert in structural forensics. No flourish, no drama, just a sentence that settled into the air like stone into mortar. Permanent, immovable. The gavel tapped softly, but its echo filled the room heavier than thunder. That sound, more than any speech, was louder than the apology my son had never learned to say. It was the recognition he had denied me, the respect he had withheld, now granted not by blood but by law, not by family but by truth itself. His pride, once so sharp, crumbled in silence, as the authority he had tried to claim for himself was handed instead to the father he had dismissed. I sat without moving, my hands folded, my eyes lowered. There was no need to show triumph. Recognition did not require celebration. It required only stillness, the acceptance that what had been spoken could not be unsaid. Around me, the jurors shifted, the gallery hushed, and for the first time, there was no laughter, no smirking, no whispered doubt. The title had been carved into record, undeniable and unerasable. My son remained motionless at his table. He did not lift his eyes. Perhaps he was staring at the documents that bore my handwriting. Perhaps at the codes he had once cited against me. Perhaps only at the wood grain of the desk that refused to offer him escape. Whatever his gaze found, it would not return what he had lost. The court had spoken, and in its voice, the truth of a lifetime had been recognized. The gavel's echo lingered in my chest, not as triumph, but as justice fulfilled. A lifetime of work, of patience, of nights spent in dust and silence, had been brought into this room and given its rightful name. I had not needed to shout for it. I had not needed to beg. I had only needed to stand steady and let the truth speak until the world could no longer look away. When the gavel's echo finally faded, I remained seated for a long moment, letting the silence breathe. I did not turn toward my son, did not search for his eyes, did not seek the satisfaction of seeing him broken beneath the weight of what had just been spoken. This victory was not a weapon to wound him with. It was not for me, and it was never meant to be against him. It belonged to something larger, something heavier. I reached for the white chalk that still rested on the ledge of the board, its edge worn from the lines I had drawn. I placed it gently back in the box, brushing the dust from my fingers. Then I closed my notebook, the same one that had traveled with me across sites, through storms, through nights when structures were born from calculations under a single lamp. My hands lingered on its cover, not as a man clutching at proof of his worth, but as someone paying respect to a companion that had carried truth across decades. There was no triumph in me, no desire to raise my voice, no urge to remind anyone that I had been mocked, belittled, dismissed. Those memories no longer burned. They had cooled into something steady, almost solemn. Justice had arrived not as a shout, not as a reckoning of rage, but as a quiet restoration. The truth had been seen, finally, and that was enough. I thought of the people whose lives had been placed at risk by greed and haste, the families who would never know my name, The children who would walk across floors that now at last would hold because the failures had been exposed. I thought of workers who trusted instructions written on drawings, of tenants who trusted that walls around them would not crumble, of strangers who never asked who had checked the numbers but trusted someone had. This moment was for them, for every roof that must hold, for every floor that must not fail. I rose slowly, gathering my things with care, as if the very act of closing a notebook or lifting a folder deserved reverence. Around me, the courtroom remained hushed, waiting for some gesture of pride, some final word of scorn. But I gave them nothing of the kind. My silence was heavier than gloating could ever be. My dignity spoke louder than fury. And when I finally stepped back, I carried no triumph in my stride. Only the quiet patience of a man who had done what needed to be done, who had spoken not for himself, but for the truth, and who knew that truth, once revealed, needed no further defense. The verdict did not end with the gavel. It rippled outward, touching steel, concrete, money, and reputation. In the weeks that followed, the landscape of power began to shift. Projects that once moved with ruthless speed were halted mid-step, permits suspended, licenses questioned. Settlements that had been tightly guarded secrets were now rewritten, figures shifting not in silence, but under scrutiny. What had been hidden beneath polished surfaces now cracked wide open, and the world demanded answers. The developer issued a press release, antiseptic and bloodless, filled with language crafted to soothe investors and distance itself from blame. Adjustments, remediation, updated compliance measures, words that meant nothing to those who had nearly paid the cost with their lives. Yet beneath the sterile phrasing, the real work began, work that mirrored line for line the recommendations I had laid out. Their fix was not their invention. It was my plan, drafted in margins, calculated in binders, spoken in court. The structures would stand, not because they willed it so, but because the truth they had tried to silence had been forced into daylight. And then, slowly, quietly, letters began to arrive. They did not come from officials or executives. They came from ordinary people. Tenants whose children had played beneath those ceilings, workers who had felt the tremor in weak floors, families who had trusted that a home meant safety. Their words were simple, often clumsy, but heavy with sincerity. Thank you for speaking when it was easier to stay silent. Thank you for protecting lives you will never see. Thank you for making sure the roof above my children will not betray them. I read each one alone, the paper trembling slightly in my hands, not from age, but from the weight of what those words carried. These strangers did not know the years of betrayal that had brought me here. They did not know the silence at a family table, the mockery, the humiliation. They knew only that someone had stood when it mattered, that someone had chosen truth over comfort, duty over pride. I stacked those letters carefully, more carefully than I had ever stacked filings or reports, because in them was the true measure of consequence, not financial penalties, not suspended permits, not press releases crafted to contain damage. The true weight of consequence was human. It was the lives that would continue without collapse, the trust that would endure because the truth had been spoken. I sat at my desk, late into the night, the lamp burning low, the letters beside me. For the first time, the silence felt lighter. Not empty, not bitter, but filled with the quiet knowledge that dignity had done what fury never could. The world was safer now, in ways most would never realize, and that was enough. The house was quiet when I returned, the kind of quiet that does not ask questions. The briefcase felt heavier than it should have, though inside it was only paper, no more than a transcript bound and stamped. Yet the weight of it pressed into my palm, as if it carried every year I had spent building, recording, insisting that truth mattered more than convenience. I climbed the stairs slowly, not with the rush of victory, but with the careful tread of someone carrying something sacred. In my study, shelves bowed under the burden of old blueprints, rolled and stacked in rows, the paper yellowed at the edges, the ink faded but firm. Each one bore my signature, not as decoration, but as responsibility. That name, written again and again at the bottom of drawings, had once been the silent guarantee that a bridge would hold, that a wall would not crack, that a roof would not betray the trust placed beneath it. Those signatures had never asked for applause. They had been promises, made quietly, fulfilled quietly. I opened the drawer where I kept the most important records, and there I placed the court transcript, sliding it beside the blueprints. It fit there, as if it had been waiting all along, not a plan for what could be built, but a record of what had been defended. On one side, the dreams of structures not yet born. On the other, the judgment that those dreams had been protected, their integrity preserved. My hand lingered on the stack, tracing the outlines of ink through the years, as though touching not paper, but the memory of all those who had walked safely across the floors I had signed into existence. The words of my son echoed faintly in memory. "You're not qualified." I heard them again, sharp as the night he had spoken them, the sting of betrayal still buried somewhere deep. But now, against the silence of this room, they felt weightless, stripped of their power, for the court had spoken differently, for the law itself had recognized what blood had denied, and that recognition was not about pride. It was about truth. Truth had been written in chalk dust that still clung faintly to my fingertips. It had been spoken in codes, in clauses that did not bend. It had been laid out in numbers, precise and merciless, that told the story long before cracks had appeared. It had been seen in photographs, in magnified images of fractures and voids, in the undeniable voice of matter itself. And now, all of it was bound into the record, a permanence no dismissal, no insult, no betrayal could erase. I sat down at my desk, the letters of gratitude stacked neatly beside me. I thought of the families who would never know my face, but who would live under the safety my work had restored. I thought of children who would run across floors without fear, of workers who would lay their heads to rest not knowing that disaster had been pulled away from them, like a shadow lifted before it could fall. They would never speak my name, and they did not need to. My legacy was not in being remembered. It was in what endured when I was gone. The transcript on one side, the blueprints on the other, and my name written across them both. Once dismissed as irrelevant, now recognized as expert. But what mattered most was not the recognition. What remained was the truth, undeniable, unerasable, written not just in ink, not just in chalk, but in every bolt tightened, every slab poured, every life that would go on unbroken because integrity had been defended. I closed the drawer gently and let the silence settle around me. It was not the silence of isolation anymore. It was the silence of completion, the silence of promises kept. My son's betrayal would always live in memory, but even that could not stand against the weight of what had been done. His words had tried to reduce me. The world itself had answered otherwise, and in that answer I found peace, not triumph, but truth. Truth is the only legacy worth leaving. And mine, sealed in ink, dust, and stone, would outlast every dismissal, every insult, every hand that once tried to close the door on me. My signature had always been more than a name. Now it was a legacy, undeniable, unerasable, carried forever in the safety of those who would never know how close they had come to disaster, and how quietly they had been spared.